The air in eastern India hung thick that night, so humid you could taste the diesel exhaust mixing with the salt from distant rain clouds. Lieutenant Commander Tokishi Nakamura stood on a ridge overlooking what the Americans called the highway, though highway was too small a word for what stretched before him. He raised his binoculars with hands that had stopped shaking an hour ago, when the counting first began. 10 trucks. Then 100. Then he lost count. The convoy line stretched beyond the curve of the earth, headlights cutting through the monsoon haze like a river of fire flowing west toward Burma. The sound was what broke him first, not the sight, but the sound. A mechanical thunder that never paused, never stuttered, never seemed to need breath. Each engine added its voice to a chorus that drowned out the jungle itself. His notebook lay open on a flat stone, pages already warped by the moisture. The numbers he'd written looked absurd even to him, 2,300 vehicles, 0200 to 0600 hours. For hours. 2,300 trucks. And the line had not stopped. Had not even slowed. He did the mathematics twice, then a third time, certain he'd made an error. If this pace held, if what he was seeing continued through dawn and into the next night, the Americans were moving 10,000 vehicles every single day. Not every week. Not during an offensive. Every day. Nakamura had fought at Midway. He'd seen American carriers burn. He'd watched their pilots bail out over the Pacific, proof that they could bleed, that they could fail. He'd been told, had believed, that America's weakness was endurance, that their soft society would crack under the relentless pressure of Pacific warfare. But this was not the product of a soft society. This was something else entirely. Something his training had never prepared him to face. As another wave of trucks roared past below, their canvas tarp snapping in the wind, Nakamura realized he was witnessing not just a supply convoy, but a revelation. America wasn't fighting this war the way Japan fought wars. They weren't pouring out spirit and blood and willpower. They were pouring out an ocean of steel, rubber, and gasoline, and they were doing it every single night. Understanding Nakamura's shock requires understanding the lie he'd been raised on. For decades, Japanese military academies had taught a particular gospel, that spirit, seishin, transcended material advantage. That a warrior's will could overcome any weapon. That the samurai who faced death without flinching was worth 10 soldiers who hid behind machines. This wasn't just propaganda. It was philosophy, woven into the fabric of Japanese military identity. American soldiers, by this logic, were fundamentally inferior. They came from a nation of jazz clubs and movie theaters, of men who'd grown soft behind desks and department store counters. They drank Coca-Cola and read comic books. They complained about mud and heat. They were, in the estimation of Japan's officer corps, constitutionally incapable of the suffering that real war demanded. The pre-war assessment seemed to confirm this. American troops in the Philippines had surrendered, thousands of them, choosing captivity over death. Japanese commanders noted this with grim satisfaction. Here was proof. When pushed beyond their comfort, Americans folded. What Japan's military leadership failed to grasp was that America had never intended to win through suffering. While Japanese soldiers were trained to carry 80-pound packs through jungles on rice rations, American military planners were calculating tonnage requirements and supply chain velocities. While Japan glorified the infantryman who could march 30 miles on an empty stomach, America was engineering trucks that could drive 30 miles on roads that didn't exist yet. Japan's strategic blind spot wasn't ignorance, it was philosophical. They believed wars were won by men willing to die. America believed wars were won by factories willing to produce. This wasn't cowardice masquerading as efficiency. It was a fundamentally different theory of warfare. Japan looked at the Pacific and saw a test of resolve. America looked at the Pacific and saw a logistics problem. The assumption of American softness infected every level of Japanese planning. They calculated that the U.S. industrial base, while large, would never fully mobilize for a distant war. They assumed American mothers would demand their sons come home after the first bloody campaigns. They believed that a nation built on comfort and convenience couldn't sustain the grinding, endless warfare that Japan had perfected in China. By 1944, when Nakamura stood on that ridge counting trucks, the assumption had metastasized into strategic catastrophe. But even then, even watching the evidence roll past in endless convoys, a part of the Japanese military establishment couldn't accept what they were seeing. Because accepting it meant accepting that everything they believed about warfare, about honor, about spirit, about sacrifice, had been rendered obsolete by assembly lines and oil refineries and tire factories. Detroit in 1942 didn't look like a city preparing for war. It looked like a city that had declared war itself, not with soldiers, but with machinery. The Willow Run plant, built by Ford, stretched nearly a mile long. Inside, B-24 Liberator bombers rolled off the line at a pace that defied human comprehension, one complete aircraft every 63 minutes at peak production. But bombers were glamorous. Bombers got newsreel coverage and war bond posters. What didn't get coverage were the trucks. The GMC CCKW, Jimmy to the men who drove it, was the unglamorous workhorse that actually won the war. 6 wheels, 2.5 tons of cargo capacity, capable of fording rivers and climbing grades that would stop civilian vehicles cold. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced 562,750 of them. But numbers don't capture the philosophy shift. Henry Kaiser, the industrialist who revolutionized shipbuilding, understood something profound. In modern warfare, every factory was a forward position, every assembly line was artillery, every quality control inspector was holding a defensive line. Kaiser's innovation wasn't just speed, it was systematization. Traditionally, building a ship took months, with skilled craftsmen custom-fitting each component. Kaiser shattered that model. He broke shipbuilding into prefabricated sections built simultaneously, then welded together in days. His Liberty ships went from keel laying to launch in an average of 42 days. At peak efficiency, one ship was completed every 4.5 days. Apply that thinking to trucks, to tires, to spark plugs and crankshafts and steering columns. The US military didn't just want more trucks, they wanted interchangeable trucks. A transmission from a factory in Michigan had to fit perfectly into a chassis built in Ohio, which had to accept parts manufactured in California. This required standardization on a scale never attempted before. Ball bearings manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Gaskets that would seal properly whether installed in Louisiana heat or Alaskan cold. The Americans turned war production into an engineering problem, then solved it with industrial mathematics. They calculated that every frontline soldier required approximately 67 pounds of supplies per day, everything from ammunition to toothpaste. Multiply that across millions of men fighting on multiple continents, add the fuel requirements for tanks and aircraft, include the rations for local populations, and you arrive at a number so staggering it becomes abstract. Unless you're the person responsible for delivering it. Which is why the US didn't send generals to India to plan the Burma campaign, they sent logistics officers first. Men who thought in cubic feet and axle load ratings. Men who understood that controlling territory meant nothing if you couldn't supply the troops holding it. Japan sent warriors. America sent supply chain managers with military ranks. The Lido Road didn't exist in nature. It had to be carved, mile by mile, through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Start with the geography. The route from Lido, India, to Burma required crossing the Patkai Range, mountains that rose over 4,000 feet, covered in jungle so dense that surveying crews couldn't see 50 feet ahead. Then came the monsoons, which turned the ground into liquid mud from May through October. Then came the diseases, malaria, dysentery, typhus, that killed men faster than Japanese bullets. Building a road here wasn't ambitious. It was borderline insane. But the alternative was worse. After Japan seized Burma in 1942, China was cut off from Allied supply routes. The only way to keep Chinese forces in the fight was to build a new road where no road had any logical right to exist. So they built it anyway. The 45th Engineer Regiment, composed primarily of African American soldiers, did the impossible work. Segregated, under-equipped, and largely forgotten by official histories, these men operated bulldozers on mountain grades where one wrong move meant a 1,000-foot fall. They blasted through solid rock with dynamite, then cleared the rubble by hand when the equipment bogged down. They built Bailey bridges across rivers that swelled from streams to torrents in hours during the monsoon. One stretch, the 9-mile section called Hell Gate, required 3 months to complete. 3 months for 9 miles. That's 50 feet of road per day, on average, though averages hide the days when landslides erased a week's work in minutes. Filipino engineers and Chinese labor battalions worked alongside them, sometimes numbering 28,000 men on the project simultaneously. They lived in tents that mold overnight. They ate rations that rotted in the humidity. They endured temperatures that swung from mountain cold to jungle heat depending on elevation. And they built the road. By January 1945, the Lido Road connected with the old Burma Road, creating a continuous supply route from India to China, 478 miles of highway that shouldn't exist, running through terrain that had defeated every previous attempt at construction. But a road is useless without vehicles to drive it. Which is where the convoy system became not just logistics, but art. The Stillwell Road, as it became known, required constant maintenance. A single monsoon could wash out culverts and undermine entire sections of roadbed. So the US established repair stations every few miles, staffed around the clock. Bridges had weight limits and traffic had to be scheduled to prevent fatal backups. Fuel dumps had to be positioned at calculated intervals, too far apart and trucks would run dry, too close together and you wasted transportation capacity hauling fuel to haul fuel. The math was brutal and beautiful. For every ton of supplies that reached the end of the road in China, 5 tons had to enter the pipeline in India. The road itself consumed resources like a living thing: gravel, diesel, spare parts, personnel. But it worked. And once it worked, the convoys began rolling. 10,000 trucks a day, feeding a supply line that stretched across a continent. Imagine, for a moment, what 10,000 trucks actually means. If you parked them bumper to bumper, the line would stretch 125 miles. If they passed a fixed point at 30 miles per hour with safe following distance, the convoy would take more than 16 hours to pass. If each truck carried 2.5 tons, the standard load, that's 25,000 tons of cargo moving down a single road every day. That's the weight of 12 Liberty ships, transported overland, daily, through mountains and jungle. Now imagine maintaining that pace for months. The motor pools became small cities. Row after row of vehicles undergoing service, tires changed, oil drained and replaced, brake lines inspected, spark plugs gapped. The mechanics worked in shifts that blurred together, sleeping in cots beside their toolboxes, learning to diagnose engine problems by sound because there wasn't always time to pop the hood. Specialist Corporal James Mitchell, a mechanic from Detroit who'd worked at Ford before enlisting, later described the system: "We had a rhythm. Truck pulls in, driver gets coffee and a cigarette, we've got 30 minutes to check everything. You don't do a full teardown, you look for what's about to fail, not what failed yesterday. Worn belt? Replace it. Tire tread below minimum? Swap it. Funny noise in the transmission? Make a note, but unless it's critical, that truck rolls. Because 20 trucks are waiting behind it." The drivers themselves were a different breed. Many were young, 19, 20 years old, who'd learned to drive in American suburbs and now piloted 2.5-ton machines down roads where the shoulder dropped into voids. They drove in blackout conditions when enemy aircraft threatened, navigating by instinct and the faint glow of the truck ahead. They drove through monsoons that turned windshields into useless sheets of water. They drove sick, exhausted, and terrified because the schedule didn't care. And they weren't just hauling ammunition. The convoys carried everything a modern army needed to function: rations, medical supplies, radio equipment, typewriter ribbons, toilet paper, cigarettes, Coca-Cola syrup for morale, spare boots, penicillin, blood plasma, concrete mix, roofing material, Christmas packages, letters. The trucks themselves consumed vast quantities of gasoline, meaning a significant portion of every convoy's cargo was fuel to keep the convoy moving. The calculations became recursive: to deliver X amount of supplies required Y amount of fuel, but transporting Y amount of fuel required Z additional trucks, which required more fuel, which required more trucks. The system worked because it was designed with redundancy built in. Spare parts were overstocked. Alternative routes were surveyed. Backup maintenance stations stood ready. The Americans assumed things would break, roads would wash out, trucks would crash, and they built a system resilient enough to absorb those failures and keep moving. 10,000 trucks a day wasn't a miracle. It was engineering discipline applied with ruthless efficiency. When Nakamura's report reached Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, it was initially dismissed as exaggeration. The numbers couldn't be real. 10,000 vehicles daily suggested a level of industrial capacity that Japan's own analysts insisted was impossible for expeditionary warfare. But the reports kept coming. From Burma. From the Philippines. From intelligence officers across the Pacific Theater. And slowly, horrifyingly, the truth settled in. Japan couldn't build this. Couldn't replicate it. Couldn't even theoretically compete. Consider the resources required. Each truck needed rubber for 6 tires, plus spares. Japan's rubber supplies, dependent on captured Southeast Asian plantations, were already stretched. The US had developed synthetic rubber production, churning out 800,000 tons annually by 1944. Japan's total rubber imports, even at their peak, barely reached 150,000 tons per year. Steel? Japan's steel production in 1944 was roughly 8 million tons. America produced 81 million tons. Just the differential, the gap between them, exceeded Japan's total output tenfold. But raw materials were only part of the equation. You also needed machine tools to build the factories that built the trucks. You needed trained workers to operate those machines. You needed a transportation infrastructure to move components between factories. You needed petroleum refineries to produce gasoline. You needed a merchant marine to transport everything. You needed industrial capacity so deep and so redundant that losing a factory to bombing didn't halt production, it just shifted to another facility. Japan had been fighting in China since 1937. They'd learned to wage war through deprivation, through discipline, through squeezing maximum results from minimum resources. Japanese soldiers carried sacks of rice and supplemented rations by foraging. They hauled ammunition on their backs. They moved artillery by hand when draft animals died. This wasn't backwardness, it was adaptation to scarcity. But what do you do when your enemy doesn't have scarcity? When their problem isn't how do we make do with less, but how do we transport the abundance we're producing? Major Yoshitoka Hori, stationed in Burma, wrote in his diary, "We count bullets. They count tons. We organize pack mules. They organize highway systems. We plan for what we can carry. They plan for what they can build. This is not a war. This is industrial annihilation." The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Japanese officers had been raised in a culture that prized austerity and sacrifice. Now they faced an enemy whose frontline soldiers had access to ice cream, recent magazines, and mail delivery more reliable than Japan's domestic postal system. American field kitchens served hot meals. Japanese troops ate cold rice, when they ate at all. The convoy system represented more than logistical superiority. It was a philosophical defeat. Japan had bet everything on spirit overcoming material disadvantage. America had bet on material advantage making spirit irrelevant. By 1944, it was clear which bet had won. The only question remaining was how long Japan would take to accept it. The convoys rolling down the Lido Road didn't just supply armies, they transformed the strategic landscape of Southeast Asia. General Joseph Stilwell's forces, previously limited by what they could carry, suddenly became mobile. Chinese divisions that had been starving and under-equipped received rifles, ammunition, and artillery. Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers, once carefully rationing fuel and bombs, could now fly sorties with the frequency that air superiority demanded. In Burma, the calculus shifted. Japanese forces had survived by moving light and living off captured supplies. But as Allied troops advanced with full logistical support, Japanese soldiers found themselves facing an enemy who didn't weaken with distance from their bases, who got stronger the longer the campaign lasted. The siege of Mykina demonstrated the shift. Japanese defenders held the city for 78 days in 1944, expecting Allied forces to exhaust themselves in extended combat. Instead, American and Chinese units received continuous resupply. Fresh troops rotated in. Ammunition never ran short. Medical supplies meant wounded soldiers returned to combat instead of dying from preventable infections. Meanwhile, Japanese reinforcements attempting to reach Mykina traveled on foot, through jungle, with hand-carried supplies. They arrived exhausted, if they arrived at all. This became the pattern throughout the theater. American logistics didn't just support operations, it enabled a tempo of warfare that Japan couldn't match. Where Japanese units needed weeks to prepare offensives, gathering supplies through manual labor, American forces could launch attacks within days of making the decision, because the supply system was already in place. The convoys also broke the psychological barrier of distance. Soldiers who knew that trucks were rolling every night, that supplies were constantly flowing forward, fought with different morale than soldiers who knew they were cut off, that every bullet fired couldn't be replaced. Japan's strategy had assumed that distance itself was a defensive weapon, that the Allies would overextend, that supply lines would become vulnerable, that jungle and mountain and monsoon would erode enemy capacity faster than combat. But you can't exhaust an enemy who treats logistics as a core weapon system. You can't wait out an opponent whose supply lines are industrial processes, not vulnerable columns of pack animals. The trucks rolling past Nakamura's observation post represented more than material abundance. They represented a fundamental shift in how wars could be won, not through heroism or sacrifice, but through organizational excellence and industrial capacity applied with relentless consistency. Most documentaries about World War II focus on the machines that killed, the tanks, the aircraft, the battleships. We remember the names of bombers and fighters, the specifications of naval guns, the armor thickness of Tiger tanks. But the war was decided by machines that built and transported and supplied. For every Sherman tank, there were dozens of trucks keeping it fueled and armed. For every B-29 bomber, there were hundreds of supply vehicles moving fuel, ordnance, and spare parts to keep it flying. The aircraft carriers that dominated the Pacific were useless without tankers and supply ships sustaining them across vast oceanic distances. The 10,000 trucks that Nakamura counted represented something historians often miss: logistical capacity as strategic power. Not the dramatic moments of battle, but the grinding, unglamorous work of moving resources from factories to front lines. Japan lost the war in many ways: at Midway, at Guadalcanal, in the skies over the Philippines. But perhaps the most decisive defeat happened on that ridge in India, when a Japanese officer realized his nation was facing an enemy that didn't just outgun them, it out-organized them. The convoys kept rolling long after the war ended, bringing occupation forces, rebuilding supplies, food aid to devastated regions. Those same trucks, or ones like them, later rolled through Korea, through Vietnam, through every conflict where American power projected across distances that seemed impossible. Because America learned the lesson that Japan learned too late: modern wars aren't won by the bravest soldiers. They're won by the best supply chains.